Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
I've spent years deconstructing my Christian faith, the one that was given to me during my first decade, taking apart all the bits and pieces, examining which bits I just can't hold on to anymore. Some of those bits that I can't hold on to anymore were supporting other bits and pieces, so those drop away as well. And yet, I still found many pieces worth keeping and building on. Sometimes I needed to modify the bits, or add a few new bits and pieces, to hold things together. But in the end, after deconstructing and reconstructing for 4 or 5 decades, I still find something in what's left on the table to still call myself a Christian. Even though others might say I've thrown away so many fundamental pieces that I don't have the right to claim that anymore. It's true that I've thrown away pieces that would make me a fundamentalist, an evangelical, Pentecostal, or perhaps even a true Baptist, and many other theological labels. I'm quite okay losing those. But ultimately, I call myself Christian, Christian, because I strive to hold values and a worldview based on the teaching and life example of Christ, as opposed to calling myself Buddhist because I practice the teachings of the Buddha, or other labels for following other teachings. Scott, you'd say the same thing, right?
Yeah, very much. You know, the issue of labels is always very tricky, kind of like trying to press down, mercury. So I understand what you're saying.
So today's episode will be the last in the mini-series that we've prepared, focusing on the question of what do I personally believe anymore about the personhood of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm going to get vulnerable with you, the listener, and share with you how I came to an answer to that question. I've spent a few weeks preparing this confession, and I found that I kept having to re-examine what I truly believe about a very complex and fundamental concept that theologians wrap up in the label atonement theology. Because Christians will say that the main thing that Christ had to do was to deal with the atonement of the human race. And so I'm going to repeatedly refer to concepts that have big names that most Christian believers don't spend much time unpacking, like penal substitutionary atonement, ransom theory, recapitulation theory, Christus Victor, and other things like that. We just don't have the time in today's episode to give a full expose on any of them. So I'll just casually drop those terms on the table and refer to a previous episode in which we've done the corresponding deep dive. If you don't understand those theological concepts or the arguments I'm making, or you just want the deeper explanation, I recommend you check out those previous episodes in our Recovering Evangelicals archive. You can also get some of those links at the end of this episode and in the show notes for the episode. Also, we've brought in guest experts over the past 4 or 5 weeks to help me or us struggle through some of the speed bumps and hurdles that got in the way, and give us some much-needed background foundational information. Often these guest experts were helping me or us see that most Christians have a very outdated, overly simplistic understanding of what the Bible really is, especially the gospel accounts, and what we have to bear in mind as we read those. This is going to be a dense episode, and it might help if I just gave you the bottom line now, to help you line up the various pieces along the way. The bottom line kept coming down to where I stood on atonement theology. Each time I made a decision that I couldn't accept a given theory of atonement, that decision raised bumper lanes or curb stops, like the stanchions in the airport security lounge, those posts with the ropes or straps that keep you from moving this way or that. They're metaphorical barriers that constrain my movement on what I say about who Christ is to me now. In the end, the only version of atonement theory that I can fully buy into right now goes by the title moral influence theory or moral exemplar theory. The idea that Christ gave us a new worldview, a new set of values or ethics, and he showed us a better way for us humans to live. So, here's the bottom line. 5 bottom lines, in fact. I think Jesus was a great moral teacher, the supreme moral teacher, in fact, and that in filling that role, he also became the savior of humanity, if humanity chooses to follow him, that is. And that he might have been the Jewish Messiah, that he was resurrected in a body completely unlike the one he had before the crucifixion, and that he was myth.
Okay, that seems like a number of paradoxical statements, I guess, at least to a lot of people. I must say I am a little surprised
Oh,
in the sense.
really? How
Yeah,
so?
well, for the last part, I thought maybe that you would come down on the side of just a great man, just a great moral teacher, and nothing kind of beyond that. So the idea of resurrection and so on, yeah, that was not expected. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how you unpack them.
Okay. I'm sure the claims about Savior of humanity, resurrected body, and myth, I'm sure those three in particular caught your ears. They might have made you lean in a bit more closely in interest or sit back hard in your chair in disagreement. I was going for some kind of a visceral response. In all three cases, I'm not saying what you probably think I'm saying. I want you, the listener, to try to distill what you're thinking right now, what emotion, what questions went through your head when I spoke those 5 statements. Because when we get to the end of this episode, I want you to look back at this moment and see if those emotions and questions have changed or if they've been resolved. Until that time, listen carefully as I unpack all 5 of those bottom line statements. I don't claim that what I'm going to share with you, the audience, and you, Scott, is entirely new. Many others will have said very similar things to what you'll hear, but I want to share these ideas with our listeners simply because you do listen to us. I know we've got a large audience of people just like us who have also done a lot of deconstructing but haven't made the decision to just leave it all cold turkey. And you might find it good to know not only that you're not alone, but you might also be able to work with some of our ideas in your own journey of making a sense of a Christian belief, even after ditching so much of traditional Christianity. So let's start with the first claim I made in my 5 statements, that Jesus was a great moral teacher, and in fact I said the supreme moral teacher. I think this is the easiest position to defend on all the different possibilities of who Jesus is. This is the one that I think is easiest to defend, for me at least, that he raised human morality to a whole new level. I think we can all agree on that. Almost anyone with an open mind, even if they're not a Christian, even if they embrace some other kind of religion, even if they're completely atheistic, I think they should all be able to agree that Jesus of Nazareth was a great moral teacher.
Yeah, I think that is generally the case. In fact, probably the overwhelming majority of people do. You'll believe that, even those who don't adhere to Christianity in any sense, even atheists and so on. However, there are significant exceptions. In particular, I think of Bertrand Russell in his book, Why I'm Not a Christian. People like Russell and others who argue that he wasn't. The Sermon on the Mount, they would say, well, the things he proposes there are outlandish and impractical. You can't love your enemies in that way. What if a guy comes to the door and he's threatening and so on? Do you just be passive? And, these kind of things. His warnings about hell and so on demonstrate that he wasn't a great moral teacher. There's some dissent, but you're right, the vast majority see it that way.
So the teachings on hell notwithstanding, I mean, that's a whole subject in itself, and we did do an episode on that, but I'm referring to Jesus' basic message that he's getting us all to love, forgive, heal, help each other, prioritize other people instead of ourselves, resisting accumulating massive amounts of wealth or seeking personal comfort. That message that he was preaching is what I think is so important.
Yeah.
And I know that other great moral teachers like Buddha or Muhammad or Confucius and others, they might have taught the same kinds of things. So I'm not saying these values and practices are unique to Jesus or to Christianity. But for me personally, Jesus tops all those other contenders for 3 reasons. And the first one is just practical. I'm very familiar with the life and story and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth because I was raised in that world for 65 years. I can quote his teachings, and for each one I've heard 10 different ways to interpret any given one of them, but I'm not familiar with what the Buddha or Muhammad or Confucius taught to nearly the same degree. And the little bit that I have learned about them has raised more problems than I have with taking Jesus as a moral compass. So that's the first reason. Again, just a very simple, practical one. The second reason I'm more inclined to follow Christian teaching than those others is it seemed to me that Jesus always raised the bar to levels higher than the other moral guides. He didn't just say, love your brother, which many people have said. He said, love your enemy. He didn't just say, be nice to others, but to love them as you love yourself. If someone asked you to give them your coat, he said, give them your shirt off your back as well. Forgiving someone not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. So always raising the bar to a higher level than those other teachers. And then the third reason I make this claim that he was the supreme moral teacher is the fact that Western society seems to have been built on his teachings. So says Tom Holland, a widely recognized historian who does not identify personally with Christianity. And his book that he wrote, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, getting at the whole idea that Western society is built on Christian values. We also talked with Michael Shermer in episode number 189. He's a widely recognized humanitarian and atheist, and even he agreed with us on this point. So for all these reasons, I'm very comfortable in taking Christian teachings as my moral compass rather than those of Buddha, Muhammad, or Confucius, or any other.
Yeah, those are strong points. I mean, sure, they can be argued with, as anything can be. People take exception. Like, for example, Tom Holland, I've seen a number of debates, some will argue that he's overstating the case and that there are lots of other reasons for Western civilization's moral foundations and so on. But no, I think those are all solid reasons for what you're proposing.
Okay. So that's the first of the 5 claims I made in my opening statement. And all I'm saying is that this is at the very least, I can be confident that he was a great moral teacher, perhaps a supreme moral teacher. I do think he was more than that, and we're going to get to that in the other 4 claims. Let's start with the second one that I made, that him possibly being a Jewish Messiah. One thing that this miniseries did for me was completely reinforce my previous understanding that Jesus was seen to be a Jewish Messiah. That everyone at that time said as much and interacted with him as such. They also believed in other messiahs that came and went. And Scott, you would know more about that than I do.
Yeah, there were certainly a number of the Bar Kokhba is one a key big example of this. He was seen to be a messiah. This is after Christ. I forget what year, but I think it was like in the 2nd or 3rd century, maybe. He led a revolt. They took over Jerusalem for a while. He even had money printed with his image on it and so on. And then the whole thing fell apart and he was killed, and most people have never heard of him. So it's interesting that Jesus isn't the only figure in the first few centuries that made messianic type claims.
And there were other messiahs besides Bar Kokhba. We don't remember the name, but there is one that's actually named in the Old Testament, and it's God naming this as the Jewish Messiah. In the book of Isaiah in particular, and then you can also get this name Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, 600 years before Christ was born. And God refers to this Cyrus as his chosen one, his anointed one. And so there were many messiahs, and at least 2 of them were, according to the Old Testament, chosen by God himself. Now, here's where I'm going with all of this. Jesus and almost everyone around him at the time thought that he was the Jewish Messiah, meant to save Israel, liberate them from, well, in this case, the Roman Empire. And I want to repeat what I just said. They thought that he was the Jewish Messiah. That's absolutely clear when you look at these accounts, and we talk to our guest experts, they would underline this as well. But whether he actually was a Jewish Messiah or not, that depends on whether you believe in a God who intervenes in human affairs or not. A Messiah is somebody who is chosen and anointed, and that requires a chooser and an anointer. I myself am open-minded to the idea of there being some kind of God, not at all like a personified being, the God of traditional Judeo-Christianity. I've lately been referring to God as some kind of a creative life force. I don't think anyone can definitively rule out that possibility. There's just too much that we humans can't possibly know. We have too many limitations, and so maybe there is a God, this creative life force, and maybe he's more than just a life force, or maybe he's more than just a person, or at least completely different from the kind of life forms we encounter on Earth. Who can really say with any kind of authority one way or the other? I'm just a bit more inclined to say that there's something more out there, that we humans are not the highest form of consciousness in the universe, and that greater otherness would certainly explain a lot of things. To arrogantly insist that God absolutely does not exist in any way, shape, or form, I think that's just a belief statement. It's not a fact. And more often than not, there's some kind of an emotional motivation behind that kind of dogmatic faith statement. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, now I know that Those listening who are atheists will argue probably that atheism isn't a faith statement. It's just a recognition that such statements that there is a God are kind of nonsense statements in the very technical sense of being nonsensible. They're not empirical, which is kind of the main point of one of the leading philosophies of the 19th and 20th century called logical positivism, which basically says that all statements outside of scientific statements are basically nonsensical. Richard Dawkins makes this point as well, that asking questions like the meaning of life and stuff like that is just pointless because the kind of questions are unanswerable. And he would put theological questions into the same category. The problem, of course, with that is that the statement itself, that all statements outside scientific statements are nonsense or nonsensible, is a contradictory statement because that statement is not an empirically verifiable statement, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. So that's the problem. But anyway, the kind of the closed-mindedness of the what you might call the radical atheists or the very doctrinaire atheists is, I think that does lead toward more of a faith position. Now, a guy like Alex O'Connor, very popular atheist YouTuber, he's more, you might call maybe a soft atheist. Like he's an atheist, but he recognizes that there are, people do have reasons for believing in God, and they're not completely irrational.
I know that sometimes atheists don't like it when we say something like atheism is a faith statement. I get that, and I'm not trying to offend them. All I'm saying is it's a statement that's not based on evidence. If I say, how can you know that there is no God? They just say, well, there isn't. And what they're really saying in my mind is they're saying, I just don't believe that God exists. It's a belief statement. And that's what I mean by faith statement.
Yeah, or they're just saying there's no evidence. So, therefore, why would I believe something on the basis of zero evidence?
Right. Well, as for myself, I'm not convinced either. I don't know for sure, but I'm open to the idea. I have reasons to be more hopeful. I'm also open-minded to the idea that this God, intervenes in human affairs. I'm open to the idea. Unfortunately, I'm just not seeing enough evidence of that to be more committed to that claim. Does God answer prayers? Usually not. If I examine all the prayers that have been made and remove the ones that were answered in a way that could easily have been random or through natural causes, especially the ones that were self-actualized by the prayer themselves, after removing those kinds of answered prayers, I'm left only with prayers that were not answered, and very few, if any, that could only be miraculous or divine. And that's why I say that God usually does not answer prayers. We did a whole episode on prayer, including this and many other points in episode number 99. Or I look back at my many attempts to get in touch with God in various ways, all the ways that people say are what you need to do, but which never prove to be effective for me. I just don't find that God interacts with me on any other kind of level, certainly not conversations in my head that I can't deny or an apparition of any kind, let alone any other kind of signal that convinces me I'm dealing with another consciousness. None whatsoever, and believe me, I have tried. The interested listener will want to check out 2 of our episodes from the past we did on the personal relationship, episodes number 42 and number 147. Now, getting back to this whole idea of a God who intervenes with human affairs, does God manipulate history to unfold as he planned it? I certainly don't see any evidence of that. And for those who insist that God does intervene, the more that one leans into that insistence, the bigger the problem one has with evil in the world. Altogether, I just haven't found any evidence to actually hold the idea. And after searching hard for this for decades, I have to accept the fact that I might have been looking for something that just doesn't exist. So, do I think God intervenes in our individual lives or on a national level or even a species level? I'm just not seeing it. But I'm still open to having my eyes opened. And so, to get back to where I'm going with this apparent sidebar, if God doesn't intervene in human affairs, then he doesn't choose or anoint any messiahs. And that's why I say that Jesus might have been a Jewish messiah. It just depends on that prerequisite. And let me remind the listeners, we found out that the Jewish Messiah was never expected to be anything other than a human. Maybe a military general, or a priest, a rabbi, a prophet, but each of these are 100% human entities. They never expected the Messiah to be divine, let alone a deity.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think this comes through in the Gospels, because there's just a lot of confusion now. Who is this guy? And he's saying things and kind of making claims that don't seem to fit in with what we expected the Messiah to be and say.
Yep. Now, our conversations over the past couple months with Richard Middleton, with Christopher Zakali, Robin Walsh, and Mark Goodacre also showed us that some of those people in the first century suspected that Jesus was more than a human. They might have thought that he was divine, perhaps even deity. But I explained in those conversations that I had to wonder whether those suspicions of divinity were actually creative theological flourishes, adding to a very human portrait. Kind of like the example that I used, the DeLorean car dressed up to look like a time machine in Back to the Future, or the Borg soldiers in Star Trek really just being humans with some window dressing. I have become convinced that people, Christians, over the past 2 millennia, have a tendency to make Jesus out to be more than he really was. Now, here's a trivial example of what I mean by this, but I use this one because I think it makes a point very well. The story of Jesus as a 12-year-old boy discussing Torah with the temple priests. I was always told that Jesus was teaching them, instructing them, and educating them as if he knew more than those religious leaders, as if he had some kind of superhuman knowledge about ancient Judaism and messianic prophecies. But I notice what the text actually says about him. Look at the story again. It's only found in the 2nd chapter of the book of Luke, and it says simply that he was sitting with the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And it says everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. Answers are obviously posed to their questions. And I realize that it does not say that he was teaching them. It does not say that he had a superhuman understanding of Torah. In fact, you could use the exact same wording that the gospel writer uses here. You could use that same wording to describe your 12-year-old niece, the one with a fascination in quantum physics. You saw her last week at the family barbecue. She was surrounded by her aunts and uncles. She was sitting with them and talking about what she knows about quantum physics as a 12-year-old, reading books and searching online. And those aunts and uncles prompted her with questions to see if she could answer them, to see how far her understanding went. In that scenario, you could use the exact same phrases that the gospel writer Luke used. She was listening to them and asking them questions, and they were amazed at her understanding and her answers. But that wording does not say that she had a PhD-level understanding of quantum physics, let alone a superhuman understanding of quantum physics. And so, Jesus might have been a precocious kid, one with an unusually deep fascination in the scriptures for a 12-year-old, but we don't have to conclude that he had a supernatural understanding of those scriptures at the age of 12 years old, born into a family who had absolutely no resources to give him any special schooling. That's just making too much of him. And again, I'll concede that's a very trivial example, but this series of episodes has given me many examples, many other examples of how people have made too much of Jesus in other ways. The writer or the writers of the Gospel of John saying he was the Logos. Again, that's a huge statement. We unpacked that previously. And the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Or Paul turning the very human Jesus into a cosmic deity. I'm going to say more later in this episode about what I think about those points, but first I need to talk about some peripherally related ideas, the ones that are needed to support any kind of a Christology. I need to emphasize which concepts or tenets that I've completely rejected on the one hand versus on the other hand those that are on the shelf for now until I have more data to decide whether I hold them or not, versus on my third hand, those ideas and tenets that I can and do still embrace. Now, for example, if I don't believe in the idea of hell anymore, then I clearly don't have to justify not seeing Jesus anymore as my get-out-of-jail-free card, my insurance policy against going to hell, right? I want to go through this list of tenets that I've rejected or put on the shelf or can still accept, not only to justify the positions I'm going to take on my Christology, but also for the listeners who are themselves also in the process of their own deconstruction. And they've also rejected tenets or put them on the shelf or still hold on to them. And if they find resonance with me on those points, it may help them to reason their way through their own deconstruction and reconstruction and give them more reason to listen to me define my Christology, because that same Christology might work for them as well. So let me start with a few theological ideas that I'm still open to and that are relevant to what my Christology might be. I've already mentioned a couple of them. I said that I'm open-minded to the idea of some kind of a God and that I'm open-minded to that God intervening in human affairs. I just wish I could be more cognizant of how he does that. I'm also open-minded to the idea of resurrection. A lot of theology and Christology hinges on the idea of resurrection, and again, I'm open to this idea, but I'm not convinced of it. Many will say that resurrection is impossible, simply because everyone who has ever lived has always died, and they stayed dead. Not only is that not true, it's also not good logic, it's circular logic. We do hear of people coming back to life at a hospital morgue, or in the middle of a funeral service, or even at the gravesite. Of course, the conclusion in those cases always seems to be, well, then they weren't dead in the first place, because dead people don't come back to life. Again, that's a circular argument. We do hear about people who showed all the clinical signs of being dead, even enough to convince medical practitioners, and then those supposedly dead people come back. Some of those people who come back report some kind of an existence on the other side. But the skeptics among us, and I've been one of those skeptics at times, we just attribute these things to any number of pre-death physiological or pathological processes. Things like oxygen starvation or inflammation in the brain. Those are our explanations because we've already assumed that it can't be real, right? Again, circular logic. I'm not saying I'm convinced by these stories of coming back from the other side. I'm just saying there's enough of those stories and enough uncertainty around them that we can't be so absolutely dogmatic. Modern medical science has pushed back on the fringes of death. Every day in every modern city, we're routinely resuscitating people who in previous centuries would have been simply buried. And modern computer scientists are toying with the idea of transferring one's very being, their existence, their soul, into a machine of some kind. We hear from mathematicians and physicists that there are many more dimensions than just the four we're familiar with, the three spatial and one temporal. And we've talked about how being able to move in other dimensions can introduce new possibilities, entirely different abilities and limitations. And don't brush this statement off if you haven't heard anyone talk about flatland. I'm going to give you a quick 101 on flatland, but later in the episode. And finally, there's the argument that anything that exceeds one's current scientific understanding can only look like magic or supernatural to us. The technological things that we humans can do now in the 21st century look like magic to people who come from a previous century, when it's simply that we have a greater understanding of the laws of nature than they did. And the technology we might have 1,000 years from now might look absolutely supernatural to us now for the same reason. So for all these reasons, I'm not going to put on skeptical glasses and try to make myself more comfortable by simply adopting the worldview that there's only these four dimensions and no such thing as an afterlife, and that resurrection is absolutely impossible. I'm taking more of a wait-and-see approach on that. And now a third point that I'm still open-minded to, the idea of some kind of an afterlife. This almost doesn't need to be said because generally speaking, resurrection connects life to afterlife, right? Maybe the afterlife is some kind of heaven. I really don't know. I'm actually leaning a bit to the skeptical side of the traditional Christian ideas of heaven. I really don't know if there is a heaven or not, but I don't have any hard evidence against it, so I remain open-minded to the possibility. That said, I've only written it into the list with a pencil rather than a permanent mark.
Yeah, the whole issue of heaven is being re-examined quite a bit in the last, 5-10 years. And there's been a lot of scholarship on this. And it seems that there's becoming kind of a consensus that biblically heaven is really seen as the realm where God rules and is present. This is the Lord's Prayer, that God's will be done on earth as it is done in heaven, right? So in other words, he rules in heaven, but not so much on earth. And the idea is that he will rule on earth at some point. But earth is the place that humans rule. And so the idea is that in Christ, heaven and earth kind of meet. That's the idea of incarnation. So there's a lot of, I think, productive work and rethinking on that whole issue.
And I want the listeners to remember, later on, we're going to talk about humans climbing a metaphorical ladder, an evolutionary ladder, and we're going to come back to this point at that time. So those are a few of the theological tenets that I'm still open-minded to. I haven't found enough reason to actually deny any of them. And I'm content to set those ideas aside and wait to find out when I get there, if I get there. Maybe I find out that they're actually true and great, but maybe they're not true and I don't ever find out they're not true because they're not true, and I'm not conscious to be confirmed of that. Okay, now for the ideas that I've completely rejected in the course of deconstructing the fundamentalist evangelical faith that I was given. And these are big ones that would otherwise require some discussion, but we just don't have the time here today to unpack each of these in detail. All that's necessary to say today is that I've rejected these ideas, and this in turn shapes my Christology. The first I'll mention is actually the first one that I began to deconstruct more than 4 decades ago. It's the first one, and it was also one of the main threads that we were picking away at over the past few weeks, which is to say the idea that the Bible only reflects God's input, God's ideas. And I'm now fully convinced that the Bible is very much a human document, and it's full of human interpretations, human speculations, and human ideas. We can debate about the input that God might have added to that, or how much he or it controlled the humans putting it together, but the human input to the Bible absolutely has to be acknowledged. You can't dismiss that. And I can no longer read it without questions or reservations. Nor can I agree that by definition it necessarily speaks with absolute authority over all other human documents simply because it's been called God's Word. I've also alluded to the fact that I just can't buy into many of the theories of atonement, which are the basis of traditional Christianity, let alone fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. And again, we can't give any time to discuss these in any detail whatsoever. Really, all we can do is to give a sentence or two to define each of them, and then maybe we'll talk for a few minutes about them in aggregate. So, what are they? These theories of atonement. Penal substitutionary atonement, that Jesus volunteered to stand in my place to take my death penalty. Ransom theory, that God owed a debt or had to pay a price to buy humanity back from someone or something. Recapitulation theory, that Christ hit the reset button in God's economy. The first human, Adam, failed, and Christ, the second Adam, succeeded him successfully. Satisfaction theory, that even a trivial sin committed against a being as great and holy as God is deserving of the highest penalty, even death, and that the volunteer death of an innocent other is enough. It's satisfactory to appease God's great wrath. Or Christus Victor, that Jesus conquered the powers of evil, including sin, death, and the devil, which held humans captive, enslaved. Each of these theories of atonement they're built on, to varying degrees, a number of ideas that I no longer hold. Ideas like that there was one original human, Adam. Eve is just an afterthought here. And everything we are and have derives from our connection to Adam. Ideas like humans originally being immortal and perfect in every way, the fall in the garden, original sin, that humans became susceptible to death after that original sin, that our sin and guilt is transmitted down through genetic and or ancestral lines, that humans became owned or possessed by some force of evil, including death and the devil, that all humans are thoroughly evil to the core and deserving only of being cast into hell with or without eternal conscious torment, that God could only accept a blood sacrifice, before his great wrath could be appeased, that the ultimate goal for all humans, or at least all believers, is to attain an eternal celestial existence beyond the pearly gates of heaven. These are all ideas that I've since let go of, and again, we just don't have the time to discuss them. The interested listener should check out episode number 17 for Original Sin, number 19 for Theories of Atonement, and number 88 for Hell. But Scott, maybe you want to say a few things here about any one of those.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground in there. I think on the atonement issue that, some understandings are definitely stronger than others. Some are quite problematic, like the ransom theory, depending on how you formulate that. But on the other hand, the concept of atonement is so ubiquitous in the New Testament and in the Hebrew scriptures that I don't think it can be ignored. And it certainly was the understanding of those people. The question is, what do we do with it? And there are many examples where our understanding of certain things For example, Jesus himself challenged the current understanding of a lot of things and basically said, but you guys got it wrong. And like the Sabbath, for example, and so on. So, I think that it's kind of it's an evolving thing, our understanding of these things, and it merits just continued exploration and discussion.
Yep. I'll admit, Scott, I did cover a lot of ground there. There's whole episodes, series of episodes, and all of that stuff that I listed there. But my point in just listing it is those are all ideas that I have now since set aside. And by doing that, by setting that aside, that constrains now what my Christology might be. I mean, my science just can't accept anadamic anthropology, the idea that all humans are descendants of the one man Adam. Nor can my science accept that humans need to reclaim a perfection or an immortality that we never had. And because my sense of justice can't accept that all humans deserve a death penalty, not only because each of us individually is so imperfect and may have been guilty to some degree for some really trivial transgressions, but also because we're descendants of Adam, who committed the greatest act of rebellion and treason, and so we've inherited his guilt as well. I just can't hold that anymore. My sense of justice can't accept that because of these two factors, each of us has enough guilt that we deserve an eternity in hell, with or without conscious torment. I also can't accept that an innocent person who has no guilt can pay that debt on our behalf. That just doesn't sound like justice to me. I know many Christian believers think they wholeheartedly accept this idea of someone stepping in to pay our debt. I'm actually not so sure they really do. I wonder if they really haven't considered deeply what this idea fully means to them. And here's what I mean by that. I don't think any of them who say they buy into this idea, if they were to lose a dearly loved one in a horrible way, parents losing a child, for example, through a horrible murder, and the killer is found and convicted in a court of law beyond a shadow of a doubt, and they see the killer of their child standing there in front of them at the sentencing hearing, if some other innocent stranger were to come along and volunteer to stand in place of that convicted murderer, who, by the way, would then be set free to live the rest of his life in a state-funded, all-inclusive vacation resort, I really don't believe that anyone would be satisfied by that form of justice and compensation. Do you think they would, Scott?
No, I agree.
Not much more to say than that.
Well, no, I think it's an inadequate. Yeah.
Yeah. Likewise, the emphasis that so much of Christianity puts on blood, I now have to say I find it disturbing now that God needs to see blood before he can forgive sin. I can only attribute this to an ancient culture, in this case an ancient Hebrew culture, that felt blood sacrifice was so important. And I know that the Apostle Paul marinated in Pharisaic Judaism that was all about sin and blood. So I'm not surprised how he, Paul, might have turned an ancient Jewish religion, which was all about sacrificing animals, thousands, millions of animals, to atone for personal and national corporate sin. He turned that into a once-and-for-all human sacrifice for universal atonement. I'm not surprised. And writers of the Gospel of John, a century after Christ's crucifixion, quote John the Baptist saying, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Something that the authors of the other three Gospels, for some reason, never thought to mention. I'm not surprised that they thought that way and wrote about that, but I can't think that way anymore. And then another one, the idea that humans have been taken captive and God needs to buy us back as ransom theory, and Christus Victor would have us believe, those theories of atonement. I can't get past the idea that God owes a debt, that he can't have what he wants, which would be us humans, unless he pays some kind of a ransom or a debt. To whom is he in debt? The devil? To some kind of personified form of death? To himself? To us? Somehow maybe we've sold ourselves to something, and so he has to pay us to get us back. It just doesn't make sense to me anymore. And another idea that our sin is so great that we all deserve a death penalty. I've said more than once on this podcast that there isn't a court on earth that would have any reason to convict me of a crime that merited even a few years behind bars, let alone a lifetime behind bars, let alone torture for the rest of my life. So why should I merit an eternity in hell with or without conscious torment? I know the standard theological argument against that question is that even a minor and insignificant infraction against such a huge and holy God, that would merit an eternal destruction in hell. I can't get behind that idea anymore either, and I think most people who do embrace that sliding scale of justice, they might be, again, I say this gently, they're fooling themselves, because by the same logic, A given crime against a homeless beggar on the street might merit a $100 fine, but if the same crime were committed against the Pope or Elon Musk, that should merit at least $200, right? I don't think anyone's will agree to that. The only theory of atonement that remains for me to hang on to that doesn't require an outdated and misinformed anthropology that has been demolished by science and isn't in conflict with a 21st century sense of justice and doesn't put uncomfortable emphasis on guilt and blood and death, the only theory still standing for me is the moral influence theory of atonement. And so those other theories of atonement don't help me answer the question, who is Christ to me now? They don't give me any language or understanding about that. I don't adhere to the idea that he's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, nor to the idea that he's conquered death or saves me from hell or gets me to heaven. But the moral influence theory of atonement does give me language and insight and definition here. And in fact, the moral influence theory doesn't even require belief in God intervening with humans, nor even the existence of God at all. And remember, I've said that I'm a bit on the fence on both those points. Now, what I mean here is that there's a growing number of Christians who can accept that human evolution didn't involve any intervention on God's part. Those of us who think that way don't get twisted into pretzels trying to explain how evolution is random in nature and yet God guided evolution. That's a contradiction. I used to say that, and I now realize it's a contradiction. So we can see humans evolving over millions of years, climbing that metaphorical evolutionary ladder in the biological and cognitive and technological senses, and, I would argue, also in the religious and ethical and moral senses. That's a big claim, and again, we just don't have time to unpack it here, but we'll steer the interested listener to our previous discussions on this claim. We spoke with a Jewish rabbi and scholar, Dr. and Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, in episode number 162, and with the atheist humanist Michael Shermer in episode 189. So, one of the humans who evolved would have been this Jesus of Nazareth, who presented a whole new worldview to us humans. Again, one centered on love, forgiveness, celebration, helping. And he left behind him a following. Believers who started sharing this new worldview, walking in it, spreading it to every corner of the globe, to every race, every gender, every socioeconomic demographic. They started in the first century just caring for some Greek widows and orphans, the poor and the homeless, collecting funds for people suffering a severe famine. And over the centuries that followed, they expanded those efforts and multiplied them. They started building hospitals and schools and universities all around the world for anyone to make use of, not just Christian believers. Setting up social safety nets, recovery programs, organizing humanitarian relief efforts following major disasters, earthquakes and tsunamis. That following produced an inflection point in the upward trajectory of human morality. This is precisely what we discussed with Michael Shermer, and he agreed with us. And yet, we humans are still so short of the goal, which, by the way, is the etymology where we get the Greek and Hebrew words for sin, falling short of the mark. We humans routinely take one step backward for every two forward on that ladder. We find it too easy to create hell on earth and stand in jeopardy of creating our own extinction or even blowing up the planet. But instead, if every human were to follow this teaching, this new worldview, we could eventually realize heaven on earth, what Scott was talking about earlier. This is what I meant in my statement at the beginning of this episode, that Jesus could be the savior of humanity if we all would just choose to follow his lead. And if there is a God, and he or it is one who intervenes with human affairs, then maybe this was their plan all along.
Oh. Again, yeah. I agree with all that you're saying there. I might even go farther, but anyway, that's me.
Right. And part of what I was saying there, Scott, was that this ladder that I'm talking about, you can buy into that idea even if one doesn't believe in a God or a God that intervenes. You can say humans have been evolving and Jesus is one of them, and we've seen that inflection point. So you can hold that idea as an atheist, but you can also take that same idea as one who does believe in a God who intervenes and had this plan all along, and we might talk later about how that plan unfolded.
Right. Yep.
So I'm looking for common ground. I'm looking at what I can believe fully.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay. So this question of who is Jesus to me now has become a question about the nature of God, whether he intervenes in human affairs or not, and more specifically a question about theories of atonement. And it occurred to me that if God does intervene in human affairs, and more specifically intervene by sending Jesus to save us humans, then the timing of Jesus' mission on earth becomes an interesting piece of data about atonement theory. When Jesus appears on the world stage, might say something about why he was sent and what he needs to do. That appearance happened long after humans arrived on the planet, thousands of years after, and millions of human lives after, if you're a young earth creationist or an intelligent design proponent, or hundreds of thousands of years and tens of billions of human lives after, if you take a more mainstream anthropology. And once he did arrive, human history continued on for another couple thousand years so far, and another 40 to 50 billion have come and gone since Jesus left. And so here's my point. If Jesus was sent to pay the debt incurred by all humankind, if one embraces penal substitutionary atonement, or to pay the ransom, if one embraces ransom theory and Christus Victor, then why would Jesus come to do that at some seemingly random point in the middle of all that human history? Why not appear at the very beginning of human history, or at least at the moment we first were taken captive, or at the very end of human history after all the debt had been incurred?
Yeah, it's kind of an unanswerable question, and.
Well, it's unanswerable, but I'm just saying it's interesting that if you hold those theories of atonement, why then did he come in the middle, somewhere in the middle of the whole history? But if you're more into the moral exemplar theory of atonement, that God decides he's going to send someone to teach humans a new way of living and to model it in a unique, noteworthy lifestyle, then one could argue that we humans weren't ready for his message and example tens of thousands of years ago, when we were very much small tribes of hunter-gatherers just trying to survive in an eat or be eaten world. But we were starting to flex our ethical and communal muscles once we started setting up empires in ancient Babylon, in Egypt, China, South America. And we were finally ready to develop a complex philosophy and set of ethics by the time of the Hellenic Greek Empire, arguably with some cross-pollination from more ancient Hebrew, Zoroastrian, and Neo-Babylonian thinking. And then the Roman Empire gave humans the ability for intercontinental travel, setting up roads and shipping lanes to reach the far ends of the known world, spreading those new ideas literally around the globe. That first century CE was perhaps the best time for a moral exemplar to humanity to step in and intervene, to give us a new set of ideas about how to get along. And now, here we are, 2,000 years later. Look at Western society around the globe, our ethics, our language, our science, medicine, legal systems, and economics, how much that is all built on Roman and Greek and Hebrew thinking. If the listener is interested in pursuing further this idea of a divine plan to use evolution to produce a species that would eventually follow the lead of a moral exemplar and achieve perfection, maybe, then let me point you to two other miniseries we did a couple years ago, completely separate from each other, but looking back, they completely complement each other. We did a miniseries of episodes on the idea of fine-tuning of the universe, episodes number 164 to 170. And in one of those, we talked to an atheist astronomer who fully accepts that the universe appears to be finely tuned to produce life, and many atheist astronomers do. That was episode number 167. But before that, we also did a whole mini-series looking at whether the universe is front-end loaded to produce agape-capable life. And for that, I'd recommend the listeners go to episode number 64, and if they like that, they should also listen to episode 156. In both cases, you've got this idea that the Big Bang was rigged. The cards were stacked. On the one hand, rigged to produce life, and on the other hand, rigged to produce life capable of agape love. And where this fits into the present miniseries, again, I hadn't planned it to go this way. The takeaway message that it's leading me to is that Christ is a catalyst, the model that showed us the way to be agape-capable beings. So, we've double-clicked on the first three claims I made in my opening statements about Jesus being a great moral teacher, arguably even the most impactful moral teacher in history, and the possibility that he may yet turn out to be the savior of humanity if we can get behind his program, and that he thought he was the Jewish Messiah, and I would say certainly he was that Messiah if there is a God who intervenes in human affairs. Then there was the fourth claim that I made, that he was resurrected in a body completely unlike the one he had before crucifixion. I'll unpack this in two very different and yet very complementary ways, one of which I'm convinced of, it's true and factual, and the second of which I'm less certain, but I'm quite open to the possibility. So I'll start with the first of those two because it's easy and undeniable. Jesus was resurrected in the form of the Christian church itself. The Bible often refers to the church as the body of Christ and Christ as a head. Jesus gave his world-changing ideas and zeitgeist to his followers, and he was killed for that. But that set of values and worldview was resurrected in and by the early Christian church, which grew and spread around the globe, infiltrating every country, every society ever since. That resurrected body went on to build hospitals and schools, institutions and safety nets for widows, orphans, the poor, old people, and others. We often will talk about how a given person who passed away, how they lived on in the legacy they left behind, whether that legacy be an endowment, buildings with their name on it, or intellectual property, the books and songs they've written, the minds and social norms that they've changed, the lasting impact they've had on societal norms, the national holidays through which they're remembered. This is undeniably true for Jesus of Nazareth and the many forms of legacy he's left behind. What do you think, Scott?
That's something that I've often thought about. The whole idea, so prevalent, especially in Paul's writings and so on, of the church being the body of Christ, that there's really two incarnations talked about, in the sense that there's Christ spoken of as an incarnation of God, but also the church being, the God's working in the world now is through the church. And Jesus himself said it, in a sense. He said, if I go to the Father and send the Spirit, then it's so much more universal, right? That if he was one person, and it's limited as to what one person could do. But if he says the Spirit, he could work through millions of people, right? Yeah, and whether you agree with the supernatural aspect of it or not, with the Spirit and all that, the fact is that Christianity did birth the church, and that church has been very transformative. And yes, lots of blots on it too. Lots of not good things that have come with it. But you can't ignore the other side. That it has been a force for incredible transformation in the world. Probably, I would argue, probably maybe more than any other that I could think of.
Right.
As far as fundamentally transforming the way that we all think about, even, the interesting thing is that there's a lot of debate these days about classical liberalism, and there's becoming kind of a wedge between the new progressive movement, the kind of, quote, woke ideas, and classical liberalism. But the interesting thing about classical liberalism is that usually it rejects the supernatural, it rejects church and authority and things like that. It is built on some assumptions that only came about through the church, right? The idea of everybody's inherent value, the fact that all people should have dignity, the fact that all people should have fundamental rights. These are all ideas that didn't exist in Rome
Yep.
or in the ancient world.
Right.
That's kind of what Tom Holland's point is
Exactly. Yep. So that's one way in which I say that Christ was resurrected in the form of the church, and that's a very naturalistic way to look at it. But then there's that other way, and Scott, you used the word supernatural. Let's talk a bit about that. I've already said at the beginning of this episode that I'm open-minded to the idea of resurrection. I say that not just for religious reasons, but also scientific and philosophical ones. There's just too much data, too many observations out there to be so dogmatic, so close-minded as to absolutely definitively state that resurrection is impossible and never happens. And to summarily declare any of those observations of people moving back and forth between life and death as invalid simply because they don't conform to your worldview, that's just not good science. Instead, I'm open to the idea that the normal process of death, which every human who has ever been born experiences, that death is a normal process of transformation. Now, sorry if this is too cliche, but one of the best real-world analogies of what I'm getting at here is the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, and I can see the eyes rolling. But I do have an even better analogy that's philosophical in nature. If you like to use your brain, then I love to use this analogy. The flat land analogy that I alluded to earlier in the episode. I recommend you check out a book by the same name written by Edwin A. Abbott. That's Abbott. The main idea here is that people in flatland can only experience two dimensions, two spatial dimensions, left, right, and forward, backward. For them, the third spatial dimension, up, down, has been squashed down to insignificance. The only way to move around in flatland is to go left or right, or forward or backward, but always within the two-dimensional plane. But along comes this Luke Jansen, a being that operates in three spatial dimensions, including the up-down axis. Imagine I extend my finger down, in air quotes, out of heaven into flatland. all of a sudden my finger appears in flatland like a little circle that grows in circumference as I extend my finger deeper and deeper through their plane of reality. Out of thin air, I just suddenly appear to them, albeit only in the form of an expanding circle, and when I pull my finger back, I become a shrinking circle, and then, just as suddenly, I disappear from their perspective. Next, I re-extend all 4 fingers and my thumb into flatland, and from their perspective, I suddenly reappear, but now there are 5 of me that suddenly appear out of thin air in flatland. And though they appear as 5 distinct and completely separate manifestations of me, some people in flatland know that somehow all 5 are the same person. 5 persons in one, a quintity. I could belabor the analogy, but I hope by now you get the point. From my 3 spatial dimensional experience, I can do things that flatlanders can't even begin to comprehend. Think of the possibilities if there were a being who could operate in all the dimensions of the universe. When physicists tell us that there are a dozen or more dimensions, the other ones having been squashed down to insignificance. And so to extend that analogy, perhaps death and resurrection are just simply, in air quotes simply, in which humans can move into a new set of dimensions. Why not?
I love Flatland, of course. It's great. It's a great book. I recommend it to any of our listeners if they haven't already read it. It's interesting that one thing that's being discussed more and more is the limits of human understanding, in the sense that, for example, we didn't evolve in order to ask these profound questions. We evolved to survive. So everything about us physiologically is oriented towards surviving in our environment. So why do we think that, how can there be any such concept of, in a sense, truth or ultimate truth when we didn't evolve to find truth, we evolved to survive? And then are there inherent limits? So I think I've talked about this once before on the thing, but if I tried to teach my cat to talk, you'd think I was a fool, because you'd say, well, cats can't talk. Well, why can't cats talk? Well, because they don't have the neurological structure to learn language like humans do. They just, no matter how much you try, you're never going to get them to talk in the sense of a human talking. And we just accept that that's a limitation that they have. But we don't tend to accept limitations for ourselves. There may be concepts and things that we're just incapable of comprehending because we're not wired for it. We're just not built for that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't possibilities, right?
Exactly.
Which goes to your point about keeping an open mind.
Right. And I am open to that idea. Now, I want to talk about how this might apply to my whole Christology then. It's interesting that the New Testament writers often describe the post-resurrection Jesus as being in some ways quite different from the pre-resurrection Jesus. Many people don't immediately recognize him when they first encounter Jesus after that 3rd day. Even close friends like Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, and his disciples who had gone fishing and saw him on the beach. In the opening verses of the book of Acts, we're told he spent 40 days with them, giving them many convincing proofs that he was alive. Apparently, this needed a lot of proving, as if it wasn't immediately obvious that it was the same Jesus who is now very much alive. He's walking through walls, he's floating up in the air at the ascension. And I know it's easy to dismiss all of this as simply tricks of the human mind, our faulty sensory perceptions. I've made that counter-argument myself too in the past. But if one's open to the idea of an afterlife, to resurrection and other dimensions, then what do I say? I'm going to just not get too dogmatic about it either way, for or against. Maybe I'll put it on the shelf for a while longer. I just think it's hypocritical to claim to be open-minded to the idea of humans eventually figuring out how to upload their minds into a computer or to begin to experience other dimensions in space and time, but to be absolutely and categorically closed-minded, closing the door on these and other possibilities. So, it's clear that the people who walked and talked with Jesus back in the 1st century seem to have thought that he was more than a great moral teacher, more than a Messiah. And we see little hints sprinkled throughout the gospel accounts, little embellishments that suggest they saw him as more than just a human, or at the very least a different kind of human. We talked about that with all 4 of our scholars in this mini-series, and I still have to wonder if those embellishments come from the Apostle Paul influencing the authors of those gospels. Paul did not interact with a human Jewish Messiah, Jesus, but with a disembodied voice and blinding light, Jesus. We kept referring to that other kind of Jesus as the cosmic deity Jesus, and Paul preached that portrait of Christ for decades before the gospel writers put pen to paper. The first theologian I talked to, Dr. Richard Middleton, didn't like that distinction, the human Jesus and the cosmic deity Jesus. He kept referring to it as a false dichotomy. And I think I better understand what he, Dr. Middleton, was saying about this false distinction. It isn't that you have two Jesuses. Scott, the plural of Jesus is a Jesuses or Jezi. Jezi.
Now, yeah, that's always a tricky one, when you write it, it's Jesus with a
Yes.
T at the end, right? Right?
Yeah, okay. Either way, I think that what Richard was saying is that the pre-crucifixion human Jewish Messiah became the post-crucifixion divine deity Jesus, the idea of a transformation from one form into the other. And so I want to take this idea of humans transforming from one form or state into another. I know it may sound preposterous, but again, let's just consider it. Let's be open-minded. An idea that is really not that much different than people suggesting we'll someday be able to move our minds or our essence into a mechanical electronic box. So let's consider it. And I want to make some side-by-side comparisons between Christianity and other religions on this point. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about a spiritual body that he thinks we'll have after the resurrection. Many Eastern religions have this same idea today. Many Buddhists call this the Sambhogakaya. And Hindus and Sufi Muslims have something very similar as well. There's also similarity between the ideas of enlightened or elevated humans in many other religions. And the elevated Son of Man image that we get from Daniel 7 and Psalm 110, the one that Jesus always identified with. Maybe we Christians can borrow some language from the Buddhists who talk about enlightenment. That human Jesus that I described a couple minutes ago, who studied, explored, meditated, and prayed his way to a whole new level of understanding and awareness of Yahweh and how we humans should relate to Yahweh and to each other, why can't we also use the term enlightened? I may not fully and precisely understand what Buddhists mean by this term. Maybe what I'm getting at here only overlaps partially with what they mean. It may also overlap with a similar term that other religions have used, the term elevated. The Greeks and Romans around the time of Jesus long believed in humans being elevated to a quasi-divine level, and Caesar is one example. He was elevated to a semi-divine level. Some theologians, like Robin Walsh, with whom we talked a couple weeks back, they're asking whether the writers of the Gospels and other New Testament texts were getting these ideas from Greco-Roman thinking. And of course, there are other religions who talk about a variety of levels between just the purely human and the purely divine. So let's look at this idea of elevated humans in the very words of Jesus himself. He always referred to himself as the Son of Man. It's strange that even though he clearly identifies himself with that name, that title, he sometimes refers to it in the third person, as if he wasn't yet the Son of Man. He hadn't yet moved into that level of self-identity. We've done more than one episode on that title and contrasted it with another very similar term, the Son of God. I'm not going to repeat much of that here. The interested listener can go to episode number 191 with Daniel Kirk and episode number 149. You need to listen to those episodes to fully appreciate how and why Jesus absolutely identified with this term Son of Man and even corrected people who referred to him instead as the Son of God. You need those episodes to fully appreciate the distinction between those two terms. But the bottom line is that this term, Son of Man, comes from Daniel 7, and it's very much about an enlightened or elevated human being. Someone who's very much not quite human and yet not quite divine.
Yeah, the Son of Man issue is a big issue and hotly debated and been a lot of study done on it for many, many years. So anybody interested in tracing that out can find lots of information. I'm sure if you type it into ChatGPT, you'll get quite a list back. But I think the general consensus is that the Son of Man, it's emphasizing the humanity, not the divinity of Jesus.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting that one passage from the Hebrew Bible, what some still call the Old Testament, the passage that's quoted most often in the Christian New Testament is the first verse of Psalm 110. The one that says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." That verse is cited 5 times by Jesus, by Peter, Paul, and the author of Hebrews, all to declare Jesus' place at the right hand of God. This image from Psalm 110 overlaps with the image from Daniel chapter 7, about someone who was more than human but not quite God, how he was elevated to a higher level and took his place at the right hand of God in authority over all the nations of the world. So, if you're the kind of person who's still open to the idea of a God who intervenes in human affairs, and you're open-minded to the idea of God choosing a human, the Jewish idea of the Messiah and the Greek idea of a Christ, then here's something for you to chew on. So that's the fourth claim I made in my opening bottom line statement. Let's now look at the fifth, that Jesus was myth. And remember, I immediately followed that up with, I'm not saying what you probably think I'm saying. I do not mean myth in the same way that Jesus mythicists mean it. I don't think I ever toyed with that idea, even in my most atheistic, my most I give up on Christianity moments. It surprises me how much some people can lean into this idea, like the people who lean into flat earthism or faked moon landings. I just think the weight of evidence for the existence of a living flesh and blood Jesus of Nazareth is overwhelming, and there are vast numbers of scholars studying his existence, not just scholars who embrace his message, but also scholars who are quite antagonistic to it. So Jesus is not a figment of our imaginations. But a scholar can still use the word myth when talking about Jesus. Scholars use certain words differently than non-scholars, and theory is one example of what I mean. We've talked about this before, quite a long time ago. To scholars, the word theory does not mean that it's our best guess so far, or something hypothetical, or that it remains unproven. Quite the opposite, in fact. To scholars, a theory is a whole body of knowledge with extensive explanatory power. When they refer to gravitation theory or acid-base theory, to germ theory or Big Bang theory and dozens of other theories, they're not expressing the least bit of doubt that these things exist.
Yeah, that's a big confusion amongst the public, I think, especially amongst conservative anti-evolutionary evangelicals. They'll talk about, well, evolution is just a theory. Well, that's not what science means by a theory. I think that the distinction is not as true in the humanities. They don't distinguish quite as much as in science between understanding theory in the way that science does. But it's, yeah, definitely.
Well, Scott, I think the key word there is scholars, because you just contrasted non-scholars and scholarly humanities people. Right?
Yeah.
When you compare scholars to non-scholars, this is where the problem comes up.
That's true.
And to get to the point that we're getting at here, how scholars use this word myth. They do not mean something that is untrue or make-believe or a figment of imagination. They mean quite the opposite. If you look up the word myth, you'll get more or less the following, and I'll read this slowly so you can map every statement in this definition of myth onto the story of Jesus of Nazareth. The official definition of myth is that it's a foundational symbolic narrative that explains the origins, values, and fundamental truths of a culture. In contrast to being a simple falsehood, a myth is a culturally important story that shapes a society's worldview, justifies social norms, and often features transcendent or supernatural elements. This definition of myth applies fully to the person of Jesus and to the story of Jesus. 2 weeks ago, we released our conversation with Dr. Luis Marcos, a literary scholar, a whole episode on the idea of myth, storytelling, archetypal characters. He talked about J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, two of the greatest myth makers from the 20th century, about them seeing the Gospels as myth, in the sense that the scholars use that word. And Tolkien and Lewis agreed that not only are the Gospels myth, but they felt that Gospels are in fact true myth.
Yeah, I think this idea of true myth, that now Lewis uses it a little differently than Tolkien. Lewis has this concept that people will say, well, there's all these myths about resurrection, they're Egyptian myths and stuff, and Jesus is just another one of those myths. Lewis counters that by saying that he would find it surprising if the story of Jesus didn't include those kind of elements, because those things express humanity's kind of deepest longings and so on. But unlike the myths of the Greeks and so on, Jesus is a real person in history. And so he's the true myth. He's the kind of culmination of these myths in history. It's a little different from Tolkien. But so I agree with all you're saying there. The only thing I would add, though, is that myth is still, even in that scholarly sense, it's still myth. In other words, it's referring to things that probably didn't exist. So when they talk about the various mythologies of the Greeks and so on, especially the gods and so on, we don't believe that those things ever existed in any way. They are ahistorical and symbolic, but they are reflecting human desires, the dilemma, the vicissitudes of human life, in that way. So I would just say that when it comes to Jesus, it's a little different in the sense that there's little doubt that he was a real person that existed in time and space, right? So in that sense, he's not a pure myth, but in the sense of the things built around him, that's where the mythological elements can kind of come in. Does that make sense?
It does, I think, but I was just going to counter because I think one of your points was that the scholarly definition of myth means that it's not quite rooted in history. And I did a very quick Google search. I just typed it. I don't have time to unpack it, but I did a quick Google search.
Yeah.
Was the founding of the USA, as the scholars use the word myth, was the founding of the USA a myth? And it said, yes, according to that definition of myth, it was mythic. We've built it into something bigger, but it's still based on historic reality.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of an expansion, I guess, on the traditional, you're right. It's become a myth. Let's put it that way, maybe, in a sense, right? That, yes, these things really happened. Obviously, the U.S. was founded, and the people that founded it were real people living in history. But the story of that founding and so on has become a myth, in the sense that it's taken on much deeper, symbolic meaning than just raw events.
Right.
You know what I mean? But when you're talking about ancient myths, like the founding of Rome, let's say, Romulus and Remus, no, I don't think any historian believes those were real. They just believe that those were an expression of Rome's founding that tell us a lot about how the Romans thought about their founding, right? But they didn't have any historical basis. So I think it can be both,
okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Like Homer's another example. Like, for the most part, it's believed that the things that Homer relates, most of them at least, aren't real. But then there has been some pushback on that to say that some of it may be real. There may have been a war, but then it was kind of mythologized.
Right. Well, we might be getting too deep into the details of what myth is all about, but I think that the term, as scholars use it, does apply to the story of Jesus. So that was the fifth of the 5 claims I made in my opening statement. I'm going to read that statement out one more time, but before I do, I want you, the listener, to try to recall what you thought when I read them out to you the first time. The emotions you had, whether surprise or indignation, offense, or maybe eager anticipation, and the questions or kinds of questions that immediately filled your head. I want to see if they're still there. So here are those 5 statements once again. Now that I've let go of so much traditional Christian thinking, so many tenets that some people think I can no longer call myself a Christian, although I still do identify as such. After all that deconstruction, I can at least say that Jesus was a great moral teacher, the supreme one from my own perspective. And that in filling that role, he also became the savior of humanity if we choose to follow him, that is. And that he and the people around him thought he was a Jewish Messiah, and he was that Messiah if one believes in a God that intervenes with human affairs. I think he was resurrected in a body completely unlike the one he had before the crucifixion, certainly in the form of the Christian church, but possibly also in some other kind of body form from another dimension, and that he was myth in the sense that scholars use that word. Over the course of this mini-series of episodes, we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at many different portraits of Jesus among the many that are out there, many different Christologies that one can hold. We talked about the very human Jewish Messiah, which is the one that Jesus himself seemed to identify so completely with, or the cosmic deity who existed before the creation of the universe and that Paul met on the road to Damascus and preached so widely all through the Roman Empire. Matthew portrayed a pacifist Jesus who told them to put away their swords, the same sword that Jesus told them to bring in the first place, by the way, while John the Revelator portrayed a warrior Jesus who returns to earth on a horse with a sword in his mouth to wage war against the kings of the earth and feed their bodies to the birds. This Jesus wants vengeance. It seems that kind of warrior Jesus particularly appeals to evangelicals in the U.S. right now, and we talked a few years back with Kristen Dumais, author of the book Jesus and John Wayne, in episode number 48. In that book, she describes the evangelical love affair with a hyper-masculine alpha male Jesus. The MAGA crowd portrayed Jesus with a red baseball cap, bulging muscular physique, and military hardware, while others prefer a meek and mild milquetoast Jesus with soft and gentle eyes and unblemished skin, holding a lamb. John the Baptist proclaimed Jesus to be the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world, and yet also described him as the Logos, an impersonal, incorporeal force of nature that embodies the laws of the universe. Another author in the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, talked about a trilemma, that Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. In this miniseries, we expanded that trilemma. We added 2 more options that, in good Baptist fashion, also start with the letter L. In addition to liar, lunatic, or Lord with a D on the end, Jesus might also have been lore with an E on the end, or legend. Those 2 additions get at the possibility that the authors of the Gospels use great artistic license, getting inspiration from Greco-Roman literature even, to transform the Jewish Messiah Jesus into the cosmic deity Jesus. As one example, just look up Priene inscription as one jaw-dropping example of this. That's Priene, Priene. It's been dated to almost a decade before Jesus was born and 4 decades before Jesus started his public ministry. And Robin Walsh did a great job of unpacking that Greco-Roman inspiration in episode 216. And the week after that, Luis Marcos did a stellar job in recasting the gospel as true myth. In this episode, we drew out a wide spectrum of possibilities for you, the 21st century listener, to contemplate as you try to figure out what to do with this Jesus. I explain why I can no longer get behind any portrait of Jesus that has him mediating the various theories of atonement, with the singular exception of the moral influence theory of atonement, which has been historically popular in liberal and Eastern Orthodox traditions but is panned by conservative and Reformed traditions. If you, the listener, have basically rejected the same list of theological tenets that I've rejected, and you're still open to holding on to certain other aspects of Christianity, like the possibility that there might be some form of God and there might be something bigger out there than our 4-dimensional existence, and that Jesus was more than just a great moral teacher, then here's a Christology for you. And let me finish this episode off with yet one more brainbuster. Even if I found out that there is no such thing as a God, of any kind, that wouldn't break my Christianity. I've given up on the label evangelical. That term has lost its original meaning and its appeal for me. And I'm getting quite comfortable with the label liberal Christian. But now I'm considering the label Christian humanist, which is not the same as secular humanism. Secular humanists see humans as supreme and self-sufficient and working towards creating a utopia. And don't Christians bristle against that imagery, that kind of a statement. But a Christian humanist sees humans as evolving from imperfection and having the potential to ruin everything and destroy ourselves, climbing up the metaphorical evolutionary ladder, with Jesus of Nazareth in the lead, redirecting us humans to a greater potential, and in that sense being the savior of humanity, the one who saves us from ourselves.
Yeah, there's a long tradition of Christian humanism that a lot of people may not be aware of. And it started really in the Reformation period, Renaissance Reformation period. And one of the main promoters of it and thinkers is a man by the name of Erasmus. And he wrote a number of very good and important books about what a Christian humanist is. And in the modern era, there's been a small but notable movement of the same thing. They often refer themselves maybe as religious humanists. Annie Dillard, one of my favorite writers, is in that camp. And so, yeah, it's definitely an area worth exploring for people. And Erasmus is he was kind of a contrast to Luther, and they had an ongoing kind of argument over the subject. But anyway, yeah, definitely worth exploring.
Okay, Scott, let's draw a line under this. To you, the listener, if you enjoyed this miniseries, let us know. Leave a comment at the platform where you downloaded this episode, and or send me an email at lukejjansen@gmail.com. I'm looking for feedback as I pull this 4th book together, and again, you might want to check our website for the 3 books that preceded this one. Scott, are we going to hear anything from you on your Christology?
Yeah, I think it's very possible.
And you don't want to give any details away right now, I'm assuming.
Well, no, I'm kind of still working through it.
Still simmering on the stove,
but,
okay.
Still simmering, but yeah.
To you, Scott, and to the listener, have a great summer, and stay tuned.
Until next time.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com or leave them at our YouTube channel. Same name, same logo. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.